So I've been very fortunate to work with two great cartoonists, Dwayne and Joe Sacco, with whom I did my last book, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own trajectory with war. As a foreign correspondent for 20 years, that's pretty much all I did, was report from war zones around the world, most of the major conflicts from the early 80s until the end of the 90s. I began covering the war in El Salvador, and people go to war for different reasons. Some people go to war, I'm talking about correspondents, because they're voyeurs, they're adrenaline junkies. Other people go to war because they're devotees of the military culture. And some people go to war, as I did, as an idealist. I had been a seminarian at Harvard Divinity School, and at the time was living in Roxbury in the black section of Boston, impoverished section of Boston, running a small church there, and became increasingly disillusioned with both the liberal church, which liked the poor but didn't like the smell of the poor, and Harvard Divinity School, a liberal institution where everybody spent a lot of time sitting around talking about empowering people they never met. I left Divinity School largely because of a relationship. I had been a writer, and I had published my first piece in the Christian Science Monitor when I was in college, and but I had grown up in a very religious household. My father was a minister and an activist. He was in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and the gay rights movement in the 70s, for which finally the church pushed him out. His youngest brother, my uncle, was gay, lived with his partner in the village, and so my father had a particular sensitivity to the pain of being a gay man in America in the 1950s and 60s. And just so you know where I get it from, the church finally told my father that he had to stop speaking out, calling for gender equality and ordination and marriage and full civil rights for people, no matter what their sexual orientation is. And so my dad instead announced that he was having an Easter service open to the GBLT community of the city of Syracuse at his church, where he had a church. And I was at Colgate as an undergrad, and my dad came down and got me and said, well, you better, I'm going to pick you up and you come with me because it's probably the last time you'll ever hear me preach. And when I walked into that room, it was a powerful message for me because even before the service started, people were weeping. People were holding hands and crying because, especially in the 70s, the church was not only inhospitable, but cruel. And my father got up in the pulpit and he said, marriage is a sacrament. Marriage is not a reward for being a heterosexual. And any church that refuses to honor the sacrament of marriage does not deserve to call itself Christian. And he was thrown out of the church. But that lesson of what it means to stand up for what's right, rather than talking about, and Dwayne alluded to that, but actually doing it, ended up being extremely important in my own career, which I'll get to at the end, because I understood that you're not rewarded for virtue. The wider world is not going to reward you for virtue, just as and I speak as someone who was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times and spent 7 years in the Middle East, much of that time in Gaza, which is why when Dwayne does his cartoon about Israel, which expresses a truth, people don't want to hear it. And they don't want to hear it not because they don't know it's true. There would be no dispute about the treatment of Palestinians by all of the correspondents that I worked with in the Middle East, but they know that speaking that truth in certain environments, such as this one, is to kill their career. And it becomes all about careerism. And when it's about careerism, whether it's in journalism or academia or anywhere else, you essentially neuter yourself as a moral force. And that's the lesson that my father taught me. When I was a second-year student at the Divinity School, I met a man named Robert Cox, who was on a Neiman Fellowship. Bob had been the editor of the Buenos Aires Herald at the height of the Dirty War, when the Argentine government was disappearing 30,000 of its own citizens. And alone among the newspaper editors in Buenos Aires, above the fold, which means the top half of the paper, every day, Bob would print a list of those people who had been disappeared the night before, until the Falconeros came and disappeared him. And he was saved because he was a British citizen. He was later knighted. And the British government intervened and got him out, but he had to leave the country immediately with his family, and he was at Harvard. And for me, that was a window into what journalism should be. And I was able to reconcile my passion for writing with the commitment to justice that was exemplified by my father. And because of Bob, I dropped out of school, or took a leave of absence, went to South America, studied Spanish with the Maryknoll Fathers in Cochabamba, Bolivia, at the Instituto de Idiomas, was a bum, pretending to be a freelance journalist for many months, lived up in the tin mines in Bolivia in Siglo XX, in a pension for 50 cents a night, where our morning shower was some miner holding a fire hose with the coldest damn water you ever felt in your life, and we would all be standing there with a towel and we'd be hosed off. And ended up going to Argentina, covering the Falkland War for National Public Radio. I did go back and finish my degree only because my mother was a professor and a seminary graduate. My dad was a seminary graduate, and they were apoplectic that what a divinity school degree was supposed to do for me. I have no idea. But I did go back and finish. And as soon as I finished, I turned around and went to the war in El Salvador. Now, when I got to El Salvador in the early 1980s, the death squads were killing between 800 and 1,000 people a month. We had the toque de queda, the curfew at night, which is when the death squads operated. Most of those death squads were either paramilitary forces that had relationships. We had 3 police forces in El Salvador, the Treasury Police, the Hacienda Police, and the National Police. And the death squads were either closely linked or interchangeable with these security organs. And the idea was to crush trade unionists, university students, intellectuals, artists. And I can remember the toque de queda would be lifted at 6 in the morning, and I would run. I would go out running 4 or 5 miles in the morning, and I would actually run past bodies that had been left on the side of the road. The press was detested by the part of the military government at the time. This was during the Reagan administration. We used to always work out of the Camino Royale Hotel in the center of San Salvador. And for a brief while, the death squads actually ran their own clandestine radio station. The rebels used to run theirs, called Radio Venceremos. And they used to call us the Piricuaco, which is slang, Central American slang for motherfucker. And they would pick up these campesinos and kill them. And they would leave their bodies in the parking lot of the Camino Royale with notes on them saying, "You Piricuacos are next." These poor peasants were completely innocent of anything. It was just the use of their body as a form of delivering a message. Now, I did go to war in the early 80s in Latin America because I thought it was as close as my generation was going to come to fighting fascism. You had not only the junta in Argentina, you had Pinochet in Chile, you had Rios Montt in Guatemala, and I would cover that war periodically, far more dangerous than El Salvador, because it was not receiving direct government support. Rios Montt, in El Salvador, when they would go into a village and carry out a massacre, with a few exceptions like El Mazote, 27, 30 people would be killed. In Guatemala, 300 people would be killed. I lost friends in Central America, including 2 colleagues who were killed in Guatemala. Guatemala was a very dangerous place to cover. What happens in war is that whatever your motives for going into war, war itself, as the culture of war, the dynamics of war, has a way of infecting you no matter what drove you there, no matter how idealistic you were. And And that revolves around the nature of combat itself. The first time that I was in a firefight where I almost got killed was in a small town called Suchitoto, where later a friend of mine, a photographer for Newsweek, would be shot through the back and die in 30 seconds. His last words were, "I've been hit," fell on the ground, he died. It's interesting that when you go into combat, right before you go into combat, and Suchitoto was a classic example of that. It was a town off of the main trunk haul highway. We would stop because at a certain point, as war photographers and war journalists, you know you're almost certainly going to get caught up in combat. This was, the rebels had surrounded the town and trapped a government soldiers in a small garrison inside the town. And at the bridge on the road going up, all the photographers would get out of the car and smoke grass and get high. Because when you're in combat, the difference, as I never took drugs in war, there was a lot of drug use with the people I worked with, but as a print reporter, I fell into combat by accident. It didn't, especially since I didn't write for Rolling Stone. I wrote for the New York Times. So it wasn't going to be, look at me like Hemingway, I'm being shot at. There was no first-person narrative. I got almost nothing, except a lot of fear out of being caught in a firefight. But photographers have to stand up, and camera people have to stand up. And I have seen some of the photographers I've worked with, James Nakwe and others, do absolutely unbelievable things. And that's why Nakwe, by the way, never drank or did anything, but a lot of photographers would get stoned because in the middle of a firefight they have to do what's counterintuitive. In my case, I scramble for cover. And in that particular firefight, we got very close to the garrison, and we took very heavy fire. Some people around me were shot. I really didn't think I was going to get out. And I speak, it's always embarrassing to tell this story, but I'm telling it because it's true. Here I was, a graduate of Harvard Divinity School, had read Karl Barth and Tillich, and you start praying, God, if you get me out of here, I'll never do this again. I mean, you really descend into total infantilism. I think one of the things that is surprising about being in combat is that when you think it's over, you have all sorts of emotions. I mean, fear, of course, and when you're deeply afraid, you think with another part of your brain. I always, in my book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, talk about being in the Sudan during a coup, an attempted coup against Sadiq al-Mahdi, and we were in Khartoum, and for some odd reason, we decided to go out and walking in the streets, which was kind of stupid at night, and we turned a corner, and it was the street to the presidential palace, and we heard suddenly all these guards flick the safeties off of their automatic weapons, which is what you do before you fire it, and instinctively, without thinking, I stepped in back of my best friend so that the bullets would go through him first. That's what happens in war, and I think one of the reasons that I find filmic images of war pornographic is because you remove that element of fear. And that's the first thing. And the second thing is you choreograph it. I was just in California and got an award that was given to me by Oliver Stone, who I like. And Stone was in Vietnam. I mean, he knows what he's talking about. But Platoon is, I haven't quite sort of gotten up the courage to ask him, but Platoon is an example of choreograph. When you're actually in a firefight, you have no idea what's going on. It's utter confusion, even small arms. In the 5 years in the war in El Salvador, sometimes you saw shadows or people moving who were firing, but I only distinctly remember once seeing someone actually firing an automatic weapon towards me. That's in 5 years, and I was in a lot of combat. What happens after a firefight, and this is true for soldiers as well, is that immediately after the firefight, the dead bodies, first of all, become trophies. So you go through all their pockets and take out all their personal effects. if you're with a particularly demented unit, they will play with the corpses, put cigarettes in their mouth, take pictures of them, put them in funny poses. But the other thing they do is they always begin to create a narrative. It's fiction. They create a narrative of the firefight. Because during the firefight, there is no narrative. You are cognizant only of a tiny parameter around you. So, and what happens when you spend as much time in war as I did, is that you learn to handle that environment. That parameter shrinks. When it's breached, it's utter terror. There's no other way to describe it. It is terror. Fear is probably too tame a word to describe what it feels like when you think you're going to die. But that circle can be very small. So for instance, I was in the Shiite uprising in Basra after the first Gulf War with the rebels, and I was taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard with a light armor battalion that was trying to punch its way north to Baghdad. And it was interesting, when I was picked up, I was in a Jeep with another journalist. And the Jeep had been rented in Saudi Arabia, driven all the way through Kuwait into Iraq. 2 countries over from where it was supposed to be. And we were stopped at gunpoint by Iraqi Republican Guard soldiers. It was total chaos in Basra because army units had rebelled, and the Republican Guard units, so that they wouldn't be identified as Republican Guards, had actually ripped the flashes off of their uniforms, so you couldn't tell which unit they were with. They threw myself and the other journalist into the back floor of the Jeep and put the barrels of AK-47s on our foreheads. People often ask, what was the most frightening experience? Sometimes the most frightening experience is actually when nothing's happening. And that was one, because they immediately drove off the tarmac, and we could feel that we were bouncing along the desert. And what I suspected would happen, or could have happened, is that we would get 30, 20 minutes outside of the desert of Basra. They would just roll us out the door, blow our brains out, and keep our Jeep. I was once stopped in Nicaragua. I'd gone out with Tom Gelton from NPR trying to find the Contras, which turned out to be sort of a bad idea because we actually did find the Contras, and they were like really pissed that we'd found them in Nicaragua because they thought that all journalists worked for the Sandinistas, and we were going to go back and tell the Sandinistas where they were. We came down this hill, and about 50 guys with guns on either side of the road pointed at our Jeep, surrounded us. And you learn, when you're cover war, to make sure your hands are above the dashboard the whole time. They marched us off into a cornfield at gunpoint, and they radioed Honduras, their base, to see whether or not they should kill us or not. And I'm sitting there listening to the cicadas in this cornfield in Nicaragua, waiting for the radio to come back, which had my life sentence on it. It was probably about 20 or 30 minutes. It was, scary. And it came back and they said, no, tell the Piricuacos they can leave, but if they ever come back, we will kill them and we will burn their Jeep. And I thought, well, that's great. Just don't burn my Jeep. As if I could care, if they shoot me through the head, I could give a damn what happened to my Jeep. So when I was in Iraq and I had been captured by that unit, they were trying to work their way north to Baghdad, and about, 50 miles north of Basra, we were ambushed by rebels. And I remember the soldiers, the first thing they started shouting back and forth is, Askari, Askari, which is Arabic for army. Is it the army? Because they were worried that we were being ambushed by a renegade army unit that would know what they're doing, rather than 16-year-old Shiite kids who had just gotten a few boxes of free guns courtesy of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Fortunately for us, they were the kids, because anytime you hit a column, you use an RPG to blow up the back vehicle and the front vehicle so you're bottled up, which they didn't do. So we jumped out of the cars, obviously, once the gunfire started. It's cold. It was cold, and very cold at night in the desert. Raining. We're crawling through the mud. I had a pair of very expensive Zeiss sunglasses that fell out of my pocket. I rolled into a ditch. I looked up. I saw the sunglasses in the middle of the road, and I thought, I wonder. Well, I didn't go back and get them. But the first thing you do is you look up. I looked up on the wall behind me to see whether there were any bullets going in the wall, because that was the only way you can tell from which direction gunfire is coming. And there weren't any. And I relaxed. And I actually remember thinking at the time, you know, you should try and be scared. But that gives you an example of how tiny that perimeter is. So what happened, to go back to Suchitoto, is I got caught in that firefight. That perimeter was broken. I was really scared, really frightened, praying, you know, like a 3-year-old, for magic Jesus to come help me out. And I got out. And this, I think, is the dividing line between people who are sane and people who are insane. And most foreign or war correspondents are insane. And that is that by that evening in a bar in San Salvador, I thought this was the greatest cosmic joke going. That I had played with God, played with death, and I'd won. And that very much becomes the mentality and the attraction for those of us who, as I did, leapt from war to war to war. And it's a sickness. It's an addiction. If you've seen The Hurt Locker, not in love with the movie, but it opens with a quote from War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning that says, war is a drug. And they don't finish the sentence, but the rest of the sentence is, one I imbibed for many years. Soldiers and Marines call it a combat high, and it's real. And what it is you are like a moth who constantly sees how close you can get to that flame. And if you do it, and this is, you know, really the subtext, I mean, I write about the culture of war, but I write about what war does to individuals. If you spend as long as in war as I did, then what happens is that it destroys your capacity in the same way that a junkie can't live outside of that environment whereby they're shooting up. And that camaraderie of other junkies. Because every time you step out of that environment, you don't fit in. I mean, I covered the war in Sarajevo, and we used to get out. Sarajevo was certainly the most dangerous war that I covered, although I had friends who covered the war in Grozny who said it was worse. But Sarajevo won the prize as far as my own war reporting. It was when I got to the city, it was being hit with 2,000 shells a day, constant sniper fire, 4 to 5 dead a day, 24 wounded a day. By 1995, 45 foreign correspondents were dead. Dozens were wounded, including my photographer who was shot 3 days after I came in there. When you fall into the culture of war, not only do you become addicted to those adrenaline drives, to that kind of dance with death, but you are able, through that experience, to replicate every synthetic drug trip available on this campus. No sleep, hashed out, zombie-like. I mean, sometimes you would do things, or I did things in war, where ostensibly it looks as if it's brave, but you're not even cognizant of what you're doing. You could see, especially in Sarajevo, where we're being hit with very heavy artillery, 90 millimeter tank rounds, 155 howitzers. These are the biggest artillery pieces out there. I mean, huge shells. Katyusha rockets, which go off in blasts of they're fired in groups of either 12 or 24, and you could hear them, they whoosh. And they could take down a 4-story apartment building in a matter of seconds and killing everyone inside. But you would see, because of these explosions, bodies that were completely eviscerated, their legs blown off, their heads blown off. All of the images that you see projected from a war zone, no matter how horrific they may seem to you, are so heavily sanitized. Because if you actually saw a war, if the public saw a war, it would never be able to wage war. When I went into Kuwait with 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, the Iraqis in the trenches hadn't had water for days. And they started walking towards us over minefields in a desperate bid to get water. And some of them would step on anti-tank mines or personnel mines, and they would literally blow both their legs off. And even then, it would take them up to 6 hours to bleed to death and die. The technical capacity to show the public war is there. You could have set up in real time a satellite feed on that Iraqi soldier for 6 hours to watch him bleed to death. And yet, if those images came back, the reality of war would be so unpalatable that it would be impossible to get the public to wage war. And that is the existential crisis that all of us who come back from war face, including most combat veterans, when they come back into the society. I mean, most of the combat veterans I know find this whole thing, thank you for your service, utterly repugnant if they're self-aware for what they have actually done in Iraq and Afghanistan. And you create a huge division between that mythic narrative of war, which dominates in the culture, and the sensory reality of war, which only those who have been to war understand and get. And you virtually speak an unintelligible language. And I think that, you know, when we talk about PTSD, we should be clear that the greatest trauma that these soldiers and Marines underwent is not what they saw, it's what they did. If you scratch the surface hard enough, what torments them is what they did. Because in wars of occupation, such as Israel's occupation of Gaza or our own occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, you never see your enemy. They're phantoms. As soon as you leave the wire of your perimeter, everything is hostile, an IED goes off, people within your unit are maimed or killed, but you have no enemy in which to strike back. If you are fired upon, it will be a brief burst of fire, and then before concentrated or suppressing fire, and certainly air power can be brought to bear, these groups will disappear back into the woodwork. And so what you create in wars of occupation, and this is why the Israeli occupation is so brutal, is what Robert J. Lifton, and this was also true in Vietnam, calls atrocity-producing situations, where you continue to take casualties, people you care about are harmed or killed, and suddenly everybody outside the perimeter becomes a target. And that's how soldiers and Marines in Vietnam could gun down women in rice fields. That's why when an IED goes off and you lay down what they call suppressing fire, you're using belt-fed saws. These are light 7.62 machine guns. They are just spraying every mud and wattle hut on every side of the road full of bullets, and they're never stopping because you don't stop. It's all about movement to find out how many dead, how many children. And in wars of occupation, and Nick Turse did a really fine job laying this out in Kill Everything That Moves, it is just one big atrocity. And that's what Iraq is, and that's what Afghanistan is, and that's what Vietnam is. It's murder. It's primarily about murder. Killing is part of war. That is the taking of the life of somebody who has the capacity to harm you. But that's not what these wars are about. Most of the people who die in these wars are murdered. And those soldiers and Marines who come back and have the capacity to face truth, and it's a painful capacity, understand that that is what they were engaged in. And that creates for them, and I think for all of us who come from the outer reaches of empire, this existential crisis. Because when you come back from that reality, you realize that everything you've been told by your school, by your church, by your government, by Hollywood, by the press is a lie. Victory is not assured. We're about to lose the war in Afghanistan. We are not a good and virtuous people. God has not blessed us above other people. And that crisis, that existential crisis, is what alienates so many veterans and makes it impossible, and I'm sure many of you know Vietnam veterans who suffer this, for them ever to fit again into that society. Because in a sense, they are our prophets if they speak out. And yet, we don't want to hear. That's what you find when you come back, that people don't really want to hear. Because it isn't just about the reality of war. It is about exposing within us our own capacity for atrocity and evil. And that shatters the mythic image we have of ourselves, both as individuals and as a nation. And this is a battle that has been fought for generations by veteran after veteran after veteran. And it is a battle that it is almost impossible to win because the weight of propaganda, which is, after all, designed to make us feel powerful. You looked at the inception of the Iraq War, and what were all the discussions? It was interviews with the retired colonels who talked about the capacity of our cruise missiles, not what those bodies would look like on the other end, but how far it could shoot, what its explosive power was. And that made us feel, by extension, powerful as well. Right after 9/11, I was in New York, and nationalism is a disease. It's one I've seen in country after country. Up and down the streets of New York, people had flags flying, holding flags out the windows of their car. My son, who was 10 at the time, said, "Daddy, what's the difference between people who have small flags and people who have big flags?" And I said, well, the people with the big flags are the really big assholes. I saw it in Argentina, in Serbia. It's all the same disease. And it is a disease that those of us who care about justice and who care about truth and who care about explaining to those who live within the heart of empire what empire does in their name, in some ways can never win. And yet, I think you find among so many who struggle to come back and speak the truth, this kind of almost messianic zeal to purge themselves of the demons within, the demons that they carry. And so that's why I think today what you're doing is important. It's why I admire Dwayne's work as much as I do. Speaking this truth is difficult. It doesn't make you any friends, but ultimately, if that truth can penetrate, it does make us better and more compassionate human beings.
In 2014, the U.S. has a population which generally does not have any immediate experience with warfare. Between 1865 and 95, between 1945, say, and 75, we did have a population that had direct experience with warfare. And I'm wondering what you might imagine the consequences of those historical differences would be.
If they'd had a draft, we would have never fought these wars, because all these kids getting killed are poor, and that's the way it's designed. Yeah, that and the creation of mercenary forces, mercenary armies, many of whom are not even American citizens. And that limits the trauma and the experience of war to the most disempowered segment of the population on purpose.
Can I add something to that real quick? One thing, too, that's different now than how it used to be is that the arts community is not involved in the conversation as much as it used to be. Say you want to understand the Second World War, the labor movement. There were novels, there were paintings, there were artists who were brought to the table to discuss these matters in a different way that wasn't just the straight society way. The way I describe what I do and what artists do, artists create their work in private. And when you're in private, your ability to be honest is greater than just devising what you think in public is. For example, if you have an itchy ass and you're sitting at home alone, you're going to scratch your ass immediately. If you're in public and you have an itchy ass, you're not going to directly scratch your ass. You're going to figure out a way, a wall to rub up against or a way to sit, And so as an artist, it's harder to bullshit because you're sitting in a room and you're just doing, you owe it to the work you're creating to be honest. Nowadays, particularly with 9/11, where's the catch-22 for now? Where's the armies of the night for now? There's just a different way of talking about war now that doesn't involve a philosophical approach, a way that artists approach it, the humanitarian way of approaching something. And I think that that's what's lacking also nowadays.
Bearing in mind the description from Mr. Hedges of, the phenomenon that occurs after returning from war and, the realization of mendacity from on high, if you will, have you discerned anything of a different reception of your work from people who have experienced those things as opposed to people who have not?
Yes. Yeah. In fact, a lot of my biggest fans are veterans from many wars, and they say that they're really glad that I'm doing what I'm doing. Most of my hate mail and my death threats early on were coming from the wives and girlfriends who had husbands and boyfriends serving, and they would say, if I was president, I would have you shot at dawn. To which I had to write back and say, well, that doesn't describe the job of president. Maybe czar is what you're thinking of or something. But after 2005, 2006, 2007 was really hard to be a cartoonist. But literally like 2008, 2009, I started to get emails from people apologizing previously for coming at me. Not the death threat people so much, but people who were saying, you were right. You were right to just to startle me as much as you did. So yeah.
Refreshing instead of the usual bullshit, and it's like, oh, somebody's validating, what I believe and what I teach. I teach sociology here, and I wanted to speak, Mr. Hedges, your talk that's titled "Captain Ahab and American Empire." resonated with me. I teach climate change, and Vandana Shiva's great statement that the real war is the war we're waging against the planet through industrial capitalism and the concept of constant expansion. And I would critique that a lot of our youth do have experience of war. It's just packaged as progress. It's packaged as, yeah. And so, Dwayne, none of your cartoons spoke to climate change, and I was wondering if that's something that you're beginning. So for both of you, just to speak about this expansion of war that we have basically, as Rachel Carson said, against ourselves, because it's really humanity and sort of life on Earth that is at stake, I believe. So,
well, it's
thank
all
you.
part of the same apparatus. War is about business. War is a business. Whether you're a warlord in Serbia who goes into a town and loots, or whether you're Halliburton or Raytheon. And the only reason we're still in Afghanistan, which has been unmitigated disaster, is because a lot of people make a lot of money off it. And a lot of people make a lot of money off the death throes of the planet. And in theological terms, these are forces of death, whether they're in Afghanistan or Iraq, or whether they're fracking or trying to drop drill bits in the summer Arctic Sea. They are the same, part of the same demented machine that is going to take us down. And you referred to this lecture, which you can watch on YouTube if you don't have a life tonight, called The Myth of Progress and the Collapse of Complex Societies, where I draw from Melville about, that we're all in the Pequod.
Yeah, I have done a number of cartoons. I didn't have them here tonight about, fracking in particular. It's such an interesting thing for me because I come from Pennsylvania, where it's a huge issue. And I did watch, like I was saying earlier, about the changing of the conversation to then become a question of economics. And it doesn't even have to be in the environment. So often you'll hear something has to be done. Environment is a good example, so we'll stick with that. So what's the next step? You have to figure out how to raise the funds to make what you need happen. And Vonnegut's got a great quote. He assumes that the planet is just going to disappear. People are going to kill themselves. And his quote is the epitaph for the species is, we could have saved ourselves, but we were too damn cheap. When the equation becomes an economic model, then we lose the ability to think logically about the situation. With fracking, for example, I remember all the signs going up, no, we're going to stop fracking. Fracking is just not going to happen. It took 1 year for those same groups to change their signs to something that was a little longer and something that I can't quite remember, but it was something like, okay, it's going to happen, but we are going to tax the hell out of the companies that are going to do the fracking. And they could still call themselves progressives. So, yes, just to speak to what Chris said, it's all about business. And when people start playing that game and saying, yeah, I can see the logic of we have to figure out how to get the money to make something happen, all of a sudden, all bets are off. What is it going to take for people to see that the species is going to eradicate itself? It should not be a question of numbers.
It's also about the sacred. It's also about the loss of the sacred. When nothing has an intrinsic value and everything is commodified, then you exploit it until exhaustion or collapse. And as Karl Marx understood, unfettered, unregulated capitalism is a revolutionary force that has built within it the seeds of its own self-annihilation because it has no self-imposed limits. And that is precisely what has happened. We have undergone a corporate coup d'etat. And as Cornel West says, Obama is nothing more than a black mascot for Wall Street, despite the fact that he's also drawing up kill lists and has carried out a far more egregious assault on our civil liberties than George W. Bush. And I speak as someone who sued him over Section 1021 of the NDA and won. He appealed it, was overturned, and now we filed a cert to get it to the Supreme Court. But this is, whether it's the use of the Espionage Act, whether it's the NDAA, whether it is the warrantless wiretapping. I covered East Germany. I covered the fall of East Germany. The Stasi had nothing on us. We have built the most pervasive and intrusive security and surveillance apparatus in human history. We are either going to step outside, and Dwayne's cartoon on the chessboard showed this, we are either going to step off the board or they're going to kill us. And that is why I was involved in Occupy and was arrested in front of the White House with Veterans for Peace and in front of Goldman Sachs. Going to jail is more time than I care to donate to the US government. But I have kids. And we have betrayed our kids. We have betrayed this generation. And as a father of 4, I may fail, but at least I want my children to look back and say that their dad tried.
But how then do we somehow get the message of the realities of war out to people? You can do it through these kinds of forums, you can do it through your art, but how do we keep getting that message out when we're not really supposed to ask veterans for the truth?
Well, there are veterans, and Veterans for Peace, Iraq veteran. These are and there were 133 of us arrested in front of the White House, who will get up and speak. But I think that we have to be sensitive to the pain that we evoke. I did a book with Layla El-Arian called Collateral Damage, where we interviewed 50 veterans who had come back from Iraq, all on the record, all with their name, about atrocities in Iraq that they had either witnessed or participated in. And in every single one of those interviews, at a certain point, those veterans broke down. And I don't play the, emotional pornography of television. I mean, at that point, the tape recorder was turned off. What happened with that book was fascinating. The same thing that happened with the original Winter Soldier, it exploded in Europe. We had written a almost 20,000 word piece that eventually became the book in The Nation, and The Guardian reprinted all 20,000 words. The Independent, it led the paper, and it wasn't the full thing, but it was probably, 10,000 words. I mean, these are massive. Radio France, BBC. In America, nothing. And the same thing with the original Winter Soldier film after Vietnam. It also was disseminated all throughout Europe and was never seen here because we couldn't confront, even the liberals couldn't accept the truth of what these soldiers and Marines were doing. Even though here we had people on the record verifying dates and times and incidents. And I think that gets back to the existential. I mean, we are just a culture utterly awash in lies. And you saw it even in World War II with the 4 Marines who put up the flag at Iwo Jima. They came back and nobody wanted to hear the truth of the South Pacific. And so one of them blew their brains out. One of them drank himself to death. I think 2 of them drank themselves to death, and the other one just refused to talk about it anymore. It's not a new phenomenon. My uncle was in the South Pacific. He drank himself to death. He was destroyed by the war. And I think that when you make a frontal assault against that propaganda, you're almost destined to lose. And I think that there are people who come out of combat who are willing to make that frontal assault, and I think that sometimes we're not aware of the emotional cost. It's why the suicide levels are so high, because not only do they have to cope with what they've done, but they have to cope with the fact that nobody wants to hear their repentance. And not just their repentance, it's our repentance.
Given your background, presumably while you were writing for the Times, working for the Times, you believed you were getting the truth out, but you said near the end of your talk that you felt that most of what's coming out in journalism is lies. Do you feel that you were getting the truth out then? Or,
yeah,
and
because I did what most reporters at the Times don't want to do, which is I was always on the front lines. I hardly ever interviewed anybody above the rank of Lance Corporal. I didn't want to go interview Schwarzkopf or hang out with the Secretary of State, or I was always on the ground. So when I covered Gaza, I lived in Gaza. And when the Israelis made a strike, I went to the strike and I wrote about it, what I saw on the ground. I wasn't hanging out with the powerful, becoming an echo chamber for their propaganda. Now, the irony is that when you work at the New York Times, that's a job nobody wants, because you're not, quote unquote, important. And I consciously, all throughout my career, threw myself into places that other reporters didn't want to go. When I volunteered to go to Sarajevo, the executive editor, Joe Lelyveld, said, well, the line starts and ends with you. In fact, all the European bureau chiefs had written a letter saying, we won't go in because it's too dangerous. But once I put myself on the ground, I now had a megaphone. I mean, when the Serbs in Kosovo would go into a village and butcher everybody and then cut off all the roads, we put our satellite phones in our backpacks and we walked in. And when we got into the village and the Serb snipers saw us, they'd start shooting at us. That's the only kind of journalism I did. And because of that, I was able to tell a very specific truth about a very localized and finite event, but it was true.
I was wondering about this discussion of who can communicate war and whether you have to be there or not, how you would respond to this opinion piece by Phil Clay, novelist who was also in the Iraq War, recently in the New York Times in February, which he says we can't make war incommunicable. And he's really sort of disgusted in this very short piece by people who say, I can't imagine what you've been through, to veterans. And he says, imagine. And his basic view is that, and I think Judith Butler, coming from a more feminist point of view, would agree with this, that we have all had experiences of some sort where we can begin to communicate. And if you cannot communicate, actually, in an effective manner, unless you've been somewhere, then that cedes war to the warriors, in a sense. They are allowed, they're the only ones who have war stories that are considered legitimate. And I was very touched, in a sense, as a person who studies war experiences, very touched by his very simple plea that you just say to people, it isn't that exceptional on certain levels. You have to understand, be imaginative.
I think that war can finally only be understood through the victims, because in a war environment, you have a gigantic gulf between the all-powerful and the powerless, those who carry weapons and those who don't. And what happens, I speak as reporters, is that we tend to be with those who carry weapons. In fact, in war, 98, 99% of the population lives in utter terror and misery. And that's why the best accounts of war, Elsa Morante's History, a novel, come out of those who have been victimized by war. I wouldn't agree wholly with that, because war is a distinct culture that has its own rules and dynamics, bizarre rules and dynamics that are unlike, I mean, you can draw parallels to domestic violence, they're there. But I think that war is about the extermination of every living system around it, not just human beings, the political system, the economic system, the familial system, everything, cultural. And in that sense, it is unlike in its totality anything that we experience in peacetime. It's not that we can't understand it or hear it. There are people who tell the truth about war. The problem is that the weight of the propaganda, both official, entertainment, cultural, popular, is so massive that it becomes almost impossible to dismantle the myth that is fed to us. And I think that, after the Civil War, when you didn't have this system of mass propaganda, veterans came back to these small towns and spoke. And that's why from 1865 until the Spanish-American War, we virtually didn't have a military, because people were able to be cognizant. And that gets the whole rise of the Committee for Public Information, the Creel Commission, and modern mass propaganda, and all of that stuff, which, of course, we have suffered from. I would say that the problem is that the interference in terms of our ability to hear truth is so heavy that it becomes hard for the culture to grapple with the reality of war itself.
Can I just say real quick, too, that's why I started my talk by saying you have a responsibility to understand that all the circumstances that lead up to that battle, that's part of the war. You can hear something like enhanced interrogation, and that should turn your stomach. So all of those things that we can have access to before we send lots of people to a battlefield to have themselves blown to bits, that's part of the war that we have a responsibility to recognize and to be really, really, really disturbed by.
We are at the end
I've
of the
got
time.
to go back to New York. We have a meeting, a bunch of Occupy activists tonight who are facing 7-year sentences for assaulting police officers. It's how they're dismantling the Occupy movement. They charge them on absurd charges, and then they give them 5 years probation, which means they can't do any activism for 5 years if they get arrested. And I'm meeting with a lawyer.
Please thank Chris
Thank you very
Hedges
much.
and Dwayne Booth.
Yeah, great. Good luck. Good talk.